970. The Answer. 877-970-2999. It's Morano on AM 970. The Answer.
Jesus, who is like you, Lord? You're a bulwark, never failing.
Good morning, everyone. It's Easter Sunday. If ever there was a time for a song mentioning Jesus, this is it. This is Frank Morano on AM 970, The Answer. You know, it really is a festive time of year. Hopefully this is a day where you're going to church, whether you're spending time with family, cooking some delicious food, or at least consuming some delicious food, or just enjoying spring, enjoying the beginning of baseball season, and the fact that hopefully it's at least another 20 hours or so before you have to be back at work to start your work week. And that's part of the reason that I so try to make an effort to have the subjects that we do on Sunday morning be a bit lighthearted, be fun, be a celebration, not of the seriousness of the world and its problems, but of some things that are fun. However, I just can't ignore the fact that the world really does have some problems, and so does our country. And I was struck by a conversation that I had a couple of months ago with Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, who is a decorated veteran, 3 decades in the Army, wrote the book, or at least the report, literally on Afghanistan, a man who was incredibly well-versed in so many different areas of public policy. And it just so happens this week, after it was named that John Bolton is going to become the new national security advisor, he said perfectly in a column for the Defense Priorities website the words that I had been looking for, but either wasn't articulate enough to find or simply didn't have the expertise to know how to formulate into words. And that's why I am thrilled to welcome Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis. Colonel Davis, thanks so much for coming on the radio with me this morning. Happy Easter.
Well, thank you. It's always a pleasure to be here. Appreciate it.
So let me begin with John Bolton. Because this is, I'm very conflicted because as a radio producer, especially on a conservative talk radio station, there is no better friend to talk radio than John Bolton. He sounds great. He's always available whenever I've needed him. He's always on a landline. He speaks in short, pithy sound bites. There's no area of the world that you could throw at him that he could shrug his shoulders and say, I don't know anything about it. And, he's always such a nice guy. He always says, have a good weekend. Thanks for calling. Thanks for the opportunity. But if you look at the kind of public policy that he has argued for over the course of the last 25, 30 years, that is light years from where I am. And I am curious, Colonel, as someone that's been in Afghanistan, as someone that's been in Iraq, as someone that knows combat firsthand and knows defense policy better than anybody, give me your view on the president's selection of John Bolton as National Security Advisor.
Well, I'm kind of, I don't know if conflicted is the right word, but I think there's a couple different things at play, some of which are positive and some of which might not be so much. First of all, we'll just talk about some of the obvious. President Trump ran on a platform that no more stupid wars, that the war in Iraq was a disaster and a mistake, and no more regime change, one of the biggest ones. And on all three of those, Ambassador Bolton has been kind of out front on saying, we should absolutely regime change in Iran. Probably we should do so in North Korea. And to this day, he still defends everything in Iraq as though it were a success. So that's a bit of a head scratcher, I'll say. But I've actually talked to a number of people recently who know Ambassador Bolton very well, and they say I shouldn't be worried as much as it might seem on the surface because of his different views on that for 2 reasons. First of all, is that the president is very firm in what he wants to do and what he doesn't want to do. And so Bolton may advise him in some areas that are contrary to what he would believe, but he is absolutely under no compulsion to give in to that and to do those things if it's contrary to what his instinct tells him. That's the first point. But the second point, on a much more positive vein, is that they say there's nobody who knows the inner workings of the government and international and talking to people than John Bolton. And so in the areas where Bolton is aligned with the president, and there are some that he is, then that's going to be great. But whenever the president makes a decision, I think that, kind of like you've just come in alluding to, I think that Ambassador Bolton will say, here's my opinion. It happens to differ from yours, but here's your decision. And so, yes, sir, I'm going to now do everything in my power to make that come to pass. And so I think that he's a big enough man to do that.
I certainly hope so. I mean, one of the big reasons that I voted for Donald Trump is because he pledged an end to this military adventurism, this interfering in Arab civil wars. If you listen to him, listen to this audio clip of him during a Republican debate with Jeb Bush. He makes the case as clearly against the Iraq War and as powerfully against the Iraq War better than anyone, certainly better than John F. Kerry did. I would argue far better than Hillary Clinton did. This is Donald Trump while he was running in the Republican primaries in a debate.
Obviously, the war in Iraq was a big, fat mistake, all right? Now, you can take it any way you want, and it took Jeb Bush, if you remember at the beginning of his announcement, when he announced for president, it took him 5 days. He went back. It was a mistake. It wasn't a mistake. It took him 5 days before his people told him what to say, and he ultimately said it was a mistake. The war in Iraq, we spent $2 trillion, thousands of lives. We don't even have it. Iran is taking over Iraq with the second largest oil reserves in the world. Obviously, it was a mistake. So George Bush made a mistake. We can make mistakes, but that one was a beauty. We should have never been in Iraq. We have destabilized the Middle East.
Colonel, from where I'm sitting, Trump nailed it there. Why then would he appoint someone like John Bolton, who, as you put it, is still defending the war in Iraq, like the guy that's fighting the World War II, the Japanese kamikaze pilot that's fighting World War II 20 years later, and as Secretary of State, he appoints Mike Pompeo. I mean, this is not the foreign policy that I voted for.
I could not possibly agree with you more strongly. And that's one of the things that got me excited about his candidacy early on as well. And certainly as having lived through this stuff and seen it on the ground to be able to know he was dead spot on. And so that is, like I said at the beginning, this is kind of a head scratcher. The only thing that I can figure and certainly hope is the case is that the same reason why the president said he chose Mike Pompeo as the Secretary of State is because he had a good personal rapport with him. And it appears that he has the same kind of rapport with John Bolton. So what I think is the case, and I certainly hope this is the case, is that he's saying, okay, I know you're way out in left field on the Iraq war and some of these other things, and so I'm just going to ignore those, but I have a good rapport with you, and I think the things that you have as strengths, I'm going to use those to get done what I need. That's what I hope is going on, because otherwise it would there's no reason why the president should radically change his views and go take something of an advisor and change his foreign policy when he was dead spot on. So I just don't think that's what's happening, but we'll find out, I guess, in the days ahead.
Now, I know you, as I alluded to, you have a great deal of experience in both Iraq and Afghanistan. You were awarded the Bronze Star Medal in Afghanistan in 2011. Before that, though, President Obama had talked about having General Petraeus using his strategy, which a lot of folks believe was a success, of a surge in Iraq, using a similar surge in Afghanistan. You were opposed to a similar surge in Afghanistan. I'm wondering, in a nutshell, Colonel, can you explain to the audience why you opposed to the surge and how that's worked out?
Yes, I can, because I was emphatic at the time. In late 2009, before he had made the decision, President Obama, I laid out in detail why that the surge in Iraq was not anywhere near as successful as people said, and even the tactical success that it did have was owing to tactical and very specific cultural issues on the ground at that time that were not in any way applicable for Afghanistan. And so I was opposed to that because the chances of it working, and I'd already been in Afghanistan once prior to this point, so I had a really good idea what the ground looked like. It just had no chance because of the conditions that, with the Taliban, with how we got to that point, were nothing similar in Iraq. For example, in Iraq, that surge was successful because it was in the interest of the Sunni insurgency to side with the Americans against their mortal enemy, the Shia, and actually Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which had turned against them. Otherwise, everyone would have been against them. So we exploited that, and that worked out for us while we were there. In Afghanistan, nothing similar was the case. The Taliban were not in any way going to work with us for any purpose because they did not have a common enemy. And so you could see it was plain that it was not going to work. Now, the other thing that I'll point out is when I got there in 2010, 2011, it was graphically confirmed that the country is so massive and so big and so mountainous that it's impossible. I mean, a literal impossibility for even 140,000 people to accomplish the objective, which was stated as prevent Afghanistan from being used as a staging ground for any more 9/11s. It was a physical impossibility. So and today, with 15,000, it's even less of a possibility.
So let's talk about Afghanistan today. The president, even though for the last at least 5 or 6 years has been repeatedly saying we're not making enough progress in Afghanistan, let's get out, the president is basically turning over what to do in Afghanistan to General Mattis and others at the Pentagon, and it looks like he's going to do some version of the same strategy that Presidents Obama and Bush did, which is to send more troops, hopefully continue to battle the Taliban to a stalemate. Tell me, in your view, what's wrong with our current strategy in Afghanistan? And if the president were to ask you, what should we be doing, what would you tell him?
Yeah, that's an easy one, and one I love to tell. What's wrong with it is, first of all, as I just alluded to, you have 1/10 of the troops now that you did in 2010, 2011 when it didn't work, and the chances of it working now are even less so, just on that number alone. But as I've been screaming since 2009, if you don't fix the cross-border problem in Pakistan, and if you don't fix the extraordinary level of corruption within the Afghan government, you could have 300,000 troops, and you still wouldn't be able to end the war. And that's what I don't think the president puts enough understanding in or credibility in, is that military can't solve this political and diplomatic problem. And as long as we keep trying that, it's a guaranteed failure. So what I would recommend is that we need to change course and say, okay, Afghanistan, we're going to change the conditions here, the government of Afghanistan. You have 2 years to get your house in order, and at the end of that 2 years, we're going to withdraw. And at the end of that time, or actually not even then, continually and continuing immediately, because our security is paramount, and no matter what anyone else does, that's important. We will continue to keep America safe with our ISR, our surveillance, intelligence, and reconnaissance. We'll continue to monitor very closely any threats that might develop that attack the United States, and we'll continue to defend ourselves as we have successfully, for the most part, since 2001. All the stuff that's been going on, we've been doing a really good job with doing that. So us withdrawing, and many people are going to say, oh, my God, that's terrible, all this void, and everyone will fill in. Look, here's the bottom line. It hasn't saved us. It hasn't helped us since 2001, and it won't make any difference afterwards. However, if you tell the Afghan government and all of this corruption and all these warlords that are running that, look, you've got 2 years to get your house in order, and then if it doesn't work, it's your neck on the line, I assure you that will give them motivation that they don't have right now.
Well, it's so interesting. And if people are just tuning in, we're talking with Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis. He gained a great deal of notoriety 6 years ago when he returned from Afghanistan and published a report detailing how senior U.S. military and civilian leaders were telling the public, the Congress, and the media one thing, and that one thing was very different from what was actually happening. I think, Colonel, though, that the fear is that if we withdraw from Afghanistan, even if we give everybody there this 2-year warning that you alluded to get your house in order, that the whole country then could fall victim to being in the grip of the Taliban again, and then the Taliban could provide a safe haven for groups like Al-Qaeda. Is that fear justified?
Well, I'll tell you, honestly speaking, that is a possibility. However, the Taliban, and they've been vocal about this from the beginning, they were so upset at having been driven out of power because of their allegiance well, it wasn't even an allegiance. They just allowed Al Qaeda to operate in their area. There is no way that they would repeat that mistake after having just gained it back after nearly 20 years of waiting. And even if they tried to do that again, we never, ever lose our deterrent ability, and we never, ever relinquish our confirmed ability to attack anyone, anywhere that's planning an actual attack on our country, and that would not change.
Let me ask you this, and I do want to pick your brain on the changing situation at the Department of Veteran Affairs, but I talk to a lot of people in our audience, and most of them these days, whether conservative, liberal, or non-political, they're all of the opinion that, look, we all want to be safe from terrorism. We all want to smash terrorist groups like ISIS, but we don't want to intervene in anybody else's war. So my question for you is how do we get into a situation where we aggressively pursue terrorist entities like ISIS, which a lot of Americans believe are a threat to our national security, without having an Iraq War 3, or without continuing a war in Afghanistan forever, or without taking one side or another in the Syrian conflict, or without getting perpetually involved in droning Yemeni civilians? How do we balance those two desires, which I feel is where most people are these days? The desire to defeat terrorism, but the desire not to get caught in these Middle Eastern military quagmires.
I am so glad you asked that question, because that is absolutely the heart of the dramatic misconception that Americans have. And I understand why, because they've been fed this to believe it. And that is that you can send tactical ground troops, conventional troops, into different places to, quote, fight them over there so you don't have to fight them over here. That was never true, as was graphically depicted when I was in Afghanistan, actually in Iraq as well, in 2009 especially, is that you can see that being there has nothing to do with preventing terrorism over here. As a matter of fact, the only rational case you can make is that it increases it, because every one of these night raids that goes wrong, every one of these airstrikes that goes wrong and kills civilians, just adds phenomenally to the number of people and reasons why they hate us, and it feeds that narrative over and over and over. And so us fighting over there will not keep us safe. I can make a much more rational argument that us withdrawing from these areas, most assuredly Syria, which is a disaster, we should not be there under any circumstances, we can assure our homeland security and the security of our people much better by redeploying our military and strengthening our ISR and other counter-terror operations, which do not need conventional ground troops overseas.
As I alluded to, let me ask you about this changing situation over at the Department of Veterans Affairs. I think it was Wednesday of last week when it was announced that the president was firing the Secretary of Veterans Affairs, David Shulkin, and then he was replacing him with the White House physician, Admiral Ronnie Jackson. First, give me a reaction to the criticism of David Shulkin as VA Secretary. Was it warranted, or do you think maybe there's more here than the public was led to believe?
I am always certain that there is more going on than what we're led to believe, and so it's really difficult from outside to be able to know whether all the things that have been said are fair or unfair. So much of that is really political, and I'm sure that there's things going on that have very little to do maybe even with all the things going on within the Veterans Affairs. But one thing I'm sure is whoever they bring in, for whatever the purpose is, we just want somebody who's going to do a good job. We want somebody who actually cares about the veterans and doesn't really care about the position so much, and wants to work and do whatever he can to improve the care and to make it consistent and fair among all the veterans. I think that's what we're all wanting.
Well, so one of the things that Secretary Shulkin cited in an op-ed for the New York Times, which I think came out on Thursday, was that the reason that he was let go had nothing to do with this trip to Europe. It had to do more with the conflict within the administration over whether or not medical care to veterans should be privatized. Now, I don't don't know if you're a healthcare expert, but you are a veteran. Based on what you've seen in terms of the problems that veterans have gotten with military treatment through the VA hospitals and other VA treatment facilities, do you think that what Shulkin is saying the president wants to do, allowing them to pursue privatized healthcare options, is that a viable option, or is it not?
Honestly, I've had the opportunity over the last 10 years especially to spend a significant amount of time in both military facilities, and my current treatment is actually in a privatized civilian facility. And I can tell you that in my view, because, all during the time I was on active duty, of course, I was on the military side, unless I was overseas. But it really comes down to the people who are operating it, because the current place that I'm at in Virginia here, the privatized place is doing a terrific job. The people that are there care about the veterans. It's evident in how they treat us. The care itself has been very good. And when I was at Fort Belvoir, the last place when I was on active duty, that place was also really good. So I think it really comes down to who's doing the service and who's in charge of that particular facility. So I think it's a little unfair to make broad categories and say privatization is good or it's bad or whatever. It all comes down to leadership, like it seems to do in nearly everything. So it's a mixed bag.
Fair enough. Two final questions, and I appreciate you being so generous with your time on an Easter Sunday, but I can't avoid taking advantage of your expertise in this respect. One of the criticisms that someone like Jimmy Carter had of John Bolton was some of the things that he said on the subject of North Korea. This was Jimmy Carter last week.
As I say, I've been concerned at some of the things he's decided. I think his last choice for National Security Advisor was very ill-advised. I think John Bolton has been the worst mistake he's made. He's advocated going to war preemptively against North Korea, against Iraq, against Iran even. And so I think that is particularly ill-advised, because the National Security Advisor, I know from experience, is the most listened to advice that a president gets. But I still think that our country can overcome it.
A preemptive strike on North Korea, a country that now has nuclear weapons. Now, that is light years from where the president has been recently on the North Korea issue. He said he's willing to talk to Kim Jong-un. At one point, he even used the term he'd be honored to meet with Kim Jong-un. Tell me where you think we should be heading on North Korea and how John Bolton might fit into that equation.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest deficiencies that Ambassador Bolton has is that he has spent so much time at the strategic level and at the head of government level, and that he's really comfortable moving in that area, but he has very little on the ground where those decisions end up. And I think that if he had more understanding of how the consequences of the decisions that are up there and how you can really see why the strategic ones won't work on the ground, so you can't make that decision. I think that's one of the areas he's lacking. And these two areas with his comments on both Iran and North Korea really highlight this, because I served in in South Korea, and I spent a lot of time all up in the area between Seoul and the DMZ doing reconnaissance and other kinds of activities. And I can tell you that any kind of preemptive strike there would have catastrophic results. Even if it didn't turn into a complete all-out war instantaneously, it would have the initial response would be, tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands die. And, of course, if it continues on, it would be nuclear. And that would be devastating to our own interests. Even if you eventually were able to take out all the nuclear weapons, which is very doubtful because of how they're dispersed, but even if you did, the cost would be so profoundly high that it would be very much counter to our interest. Instead, and as you mentioned, I think the president is starting to move in this direction, and I strongly encourage him to continue doing so. We have the ability to deter North Korea indefinitely. Time is not running out. As a matter of fact, time is on our side, and it's not on Kim Jong-un's side, because he's under those sanctions, which have been really biting since September of last year. But with more time, they'll cause even more problems, whereas we don't have that pressure. So our nuclear and conventional military deterrent will absolutely keep him from launching any weapons or starting a war, because he knows that if it's his start, if he initiates it, then even the Chinese have said, you're on your own. We're not going to do anything. And he knows that it would be suicide. China has also said, however, I'm sorry, real quick, that if we start something, then they're going to be on his side. And I think that was reinforced with this recent meeting.
Yeah. No. I think speaking as a layman, it seems like you're right. We're talking with Colonel Danny Davis. He is a military expert and defense fellow with Defense Priorities. Now, what is Defense Priorities for folks that don't know?
It's a relatively new group. I joined them shortly after they formed, and I was thrilled to do so because we're kind of fitting in a space that no one else had been in, because it seems like you're either over on the left and you want interventions for all these different reasons, or you're way over to the right and you're a neocon, you want to kill everybody and blow everything up. And we're saying, hey, we want a strong national defense, but a restrained foreign policy that actually accomplishes and benefits American interests worldwide. And that's what they're about, and that's why I'm happy to be with them.
Well, let me make this my final question, because the two things that the last two budgets that the president signed had in common, and that he was very proud of, was dramatic increases in funding for the military. Even, I guess, 8 days ago, when the president signed this omnibus spending bill, he indicated he wasn't happy about it, would not sign a bill like this again, but he needed to, because the military needed to be rebuilt. Now, I've heard some criticism on the other side that, we're already spending way too much money on the military, that these budgets end up being a giveaway to military contractors. As a guy that's been in the policy arena and on the battlefield, which of those ends of the equation is closer to the truth?
Well, I think that we are spending too much money, and not just in a dollar figure. It's not like, well, we should only be spending whatever, $685 billion or whatever. If the problem is we have systemic internal problems with the military that's making us unready on one point, because we're not spending the money wisely. As I've seen it when I've been in some of these futuristic programs like the Future Combat Systems, I've seen from the inside how acquisition doesn't work very well. But the other major issue is, look, you don't need all this massive amount of money if you don't make sure that you're in permanent war in Syria, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Yemen at all, Libya, et cetera. If we don't have this mentality and this foreign policy that says we have to be militarily engaged everywhere all the time, I mean, that could save tens of billions of dollars just from not engaging in combat operations. I mean, look, $45 billion a year in Afghanistan by itself. And you can see it doesn't take much more addition to that to see how a bunch of our money is just going to fund things that actually work contrary to our national interest. That's
for sure. Colonel Davis, it has been a real pleasure talking with you. I hope we can talk again soon.
Look forward to it. Thank you.
That is Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, decorated veteran, served in Operation Desert Storm, served in Iraq in 2009, served 2 tours of duties in Afghanistan, repeated Bronze Star Medal of Valor winner. You can learn more about him and Defense Priorities at defensepriorities.org. I'll be happy to take your calls next if you want to call in on any of the subjects that we just discussed.